Daniel Carter checked his reflection in the hallway mirror for the fourth time in 10 minutes. And if you had told him 3 years ago that a simple dinner reservation could make his hands shake like this, he would have laughed you out of the room. But nothing about his life felt simple anymore. And if this story teaches you anything tonight, it is that the moment you think you have your world figured out is exactly when it decides to surprise you. Before we go any further, if you have ever loved someone quietly, lost someone suddenly, or tried to rebuild a life for a child who depends on you for everything, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because stories like this one are made for people like you, and you will not want to miss what happens at that dinner table tonight. 2 years earlier, Daniel had buried his wife, Rachel, on a gray October morning that he still could not fully remember without his chest tightening. She had been the one who knew how to braid their daughter Lily's hair, the one who remembered which stuffed rabbit had to sleep on the left side of the pillow, the one who filled their small house with a kind of noise that made it feel alive. When she was gone, Daniel had been left standing in the wreckage of a life he had never planned to build alone. An 8-year-old daughter looking up at him with Rachel's exact same eyes, waiting for him to somehow know what to do next. The mornings were always the hardest part. Daniel had learned that grief did not announce itself in the big, dramatic moments people expected. It hid instead in the small rituals of an ordinary Tuesday, in the way he still automatically poured 2 cups of coffee before catching himself and pouring the second one down the sink, in the way he reached for his phone to text Rachel about Lily's school project before remembering, all over again, that there was no one on the other end anymore. He had become fluent in a particular kind of loneliness, the kind that did not look like loneliness from the outside, because his days were so full, packed with school drop-offs and client meetings and packed lunches and quarterly reports, and yet somehow every hour of it felt like it was happening in an empty room. Lily had become his anchor in those early months, the reason he got out of bed on the mornings when getting out of bed felt like the hardest task in the world, and slowly, one exhausted day at a time, he had learned how to be both mother and father to a little girl who deserved every ounce of steadiness he could give her, even when he had almost none left to give himself. He had thrown himself into work, because it was the only thing that still made sense, climbing the ranks at Halden Marketing Group, under the watchful, exacting eye of his boss, Richard Sanderson, a man known throughout the office for his clipped sentences, his spotless suits, and his complete lack of patience for excuses. Daniel had earned Richard's respect the hard way, through late nights, flawless pitches, and a quiet competence that never asked for credit. There was a promotion on the table now, a senior director position that would change everything for him and Lily, and everyone in the office knew that Richard was watching to see who could handle the pressure without cracking. What nobody at the office knew, except for his closest friend Melissa Grant, was how much Daniel had been cracking on the inside. Melissa worked 2 desks down from him, and in the years since Rachel's death she had become the kind of friend who did not need permission to worry about him. She had watched him eat lunch alone at his desk for 2 years straight, had seen the way his eyes lingered a little too long on families in the elevator, had noticed how he flinched every time someone mentioned date night plans. So when she finally cornered him by the coffee machine on a Tuesday afternoon and told him she was setting him up with her younger sister, Ava, Daniel had almost dropped his mug. "Absolutely not," he had said. The same way he said it every single time Melissa brought up the subject, which was roughly once a month for the past year. "You have said no to me 12 times, Daniel, and I have counted," Melissa said, crossing her arms in that way that meant she was not going to budge. "Ava is smart, she is kind, she works with kids for a living, and she has heard enough about you that she is curious. One dinner. If it is terrible, you never have to see her again, and I will personally never bring it up." Daniel had looked at her for a long moment, thinking about Lily's small voice asking him just last week why he never smiled the way he used to in the photographs on the mantel. He thought about the quiet loneliness that crept into the house after Lily fell asleep, the way he sometimes sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee just to avoid the silence of the living room. Maybe, he had thought, it was time to try. One dinner, he had finally agreed. That is all I am promising. Melissa had booked the reservation herself, at a restaurant called the Oakwood, an upscale place downtown, known for its warm lighting, its excellent wine list, and its reputation as the spot where half the city's business deals seemed to get closed over steak and candlelight. Daniel had not thought twice about the location. It was a nice restaurant, nothing more, and he had no reason to think that anyone from his professional life would ever have a reason to be there on the same Friday night he chose to step back into the world of dating for the first time in nearly a decade. He arrived 15 minutes early, which Melissa had told him was exactly correct. Not so early that it looked desperate, not so late that it looked careless. He wore the navy blazer Rachel had once told him made his shoulders look broader than they have the way. And he had spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding whether that memory should make him feel guilty or grateful. The hostess led him to a table near the center of the dining room, and he sat down, smoothing the napkin over his lap, checking his phone one more time to make sure the babysitter, a college student named Sophie, who lived 2 streets over, had his number saved correctly, in case anything happened with Lily. Ava arrived 7 minutes later, and Daniel's first thought was that Melissa had not exaggerated a single detail. She had warm brown eyes, an easy smile, and the kind of quiet confidence that made the initial awkwardness of a blind date dissolve almost instantly. She worked as a pediatric occupational therapist, she told him within the first 5 minutes, which explained the gentle patience in the way she spoke, the way she listened without rushing to fill every silence with her own words. Daniel found himself relaxing in a way he had not expected, laughing at her stories about difficult toddlers and stubborn parents, telling her, tentatively at first and then with more ease, about Lily's obsession with dinosaurs and her recent insistence that she wanted to be a marine biologist and an astronaut at the same time. There was something disarming about the way Ava asked questions, never prying, never treating his answers like a checklist to determine his suitability, but genuinely curious in a way that made him want to keep talking. She asked him what Rachel had been like, not with the careful, tiptoeing tone most people used when they mentioned his late wife, but with warm, open curiosity, as though she understood that Rachel would always be part of the story of who Daniel was, and that acknowledging her was not a threat, but simply the truth. Daniel found himself telling Ava about the way Rachel used to sing off-key in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, about her stubborn insistence on growing tomatoes in a yard with terrible soil, about the small, ordinary details of a marriage that he had not spoken aloud to anyone in months. It surprised him how good it felt to say her name out loud, without his voice cracking, how Ava simply listened, nodding, letting the memory exist between them, without trying to smooth it over or rush past it. In turn, Ava told him about her own life, about the winding path that had led her from studying dance in college to working with children who struggled with sensory processing disorders, about the tiny victories that made the job worth every difficult day. A nonverbal 4-year-old finally making eye contact, a boy with severe anxiety finally tying his own shoes without a meltdown. She spoke about her patience, the way Daniel spoke about Lily, with a tenderness that had nothing performative in it. And somewhere between the breadbasket and the arrival of their entrees, Daniel realized he had not thought about work, about deadlines, about the promotion hanging over his head, in almost 45 uninterrupted minutes. It was the longest stretch of peace he had allowed himself in, longer than he could remember. It was somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, right as Daniel was beginning to think that Melissa might have actually done something right for once, that he glanced toward the entrance and felt every muscle in his body go rigid. Richard Sanderson was walking through the door of the Oakwood, dressed in a charcoal suit, his arm looped through his wife's, as the hostess guided them toward a table. And not just any table. The hostess was seating them at the foretop, directly beside Daniel and Ava, close enough that a normal conversational voice would easily carry between the two tables. Daniel felt his stomach drop somewhere near his shoes. Of all the restaurants in the entire city, of all the nights, his boss, the man deciding whether or not he would receive the most important promotion of his career, was about to sit close enough to watch him on a first date he had barely agreed to go on. He tried to angle his body slightly away, tried to lower his voice, tried to will himself invisible, but it was too late. Richard's eyes swept across the room in the automatic, assessing way they always did, and landed directly on Daniel. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossed Richard's face. Then he offered a small, controlled nod, the kind of acknowledgement that could have meant anything from mild surprise to quiet judgment, and he continued to his seat as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel forced a smile back and immediately felt sweat prickling at the back of his neck. "Are you okay?" Ava asked, tilting her head, noticing the sudden shift in his posture. "That is my boss," Daniel whispered, leaning slightly across the table. "Richard Sanderson. He is sitting right there. He is the one deciding whether I get the senior director position next month." Ava's eyebrows rose, and for a moment, Daniel worried she would think he was making excuses to end the date early, the way he had ended so many things early over the past 2 years, always retreating before anything could grow into something that might hurt him again. But instead, she reached across the table and gave his hand a small, steadying squeeze. "Then let us just have dinner," she said simply. "You are allowed to have a life outside of work, Daniel. If he is any kind of decent boss, he already knows that." Daniel wanted to believe her, but the rest of the meal became a careful performance. Every laugh measured, every word chosen with the awareness that Richard's table was close enough to overhear. He tried to focus on Ava, on the genuine warmth in her stories, on the surprising comfort of being seen by someone who was not looking at him, with the cautious sympathy that colleagues and neighbors had worn around him since Rachel died. But every few minutes his eyes darted involuntarily toward the neighboring table, watching Richard laugh softly at something his wife said, watching the way the older man's stiff posture softened slightly in her presence, a version of Richard that Daniel had genuinely never seen in 3 years of working under him. The turning point came just after the entrees arrived, when Daniel's phone buzzed against the table with a sharp, insistent vibration. He glanced down and saw Sophie's name on the screen, and something in him went cold immediately. The particular instinct every parent develops after loss, the reflex that assumes the worst before any evidence has been given. "I am so sorry," he said to Ava, already standing. "I have to take this." "It is the babysitter." He answered the call 3 steps from the table, his voice low but urgent. "Sophie, is everything okay?" "She is fine. She is fine," Sophie said quickly, though Daniel could hear Lily crying in the background, the kind of crying that came from fear rather than injury. "She had a nightmare about her mom, and she is asking for you. I tried to calm her down, but she really wants to hear your voice." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, torn between the dinner table behind him and the small, frightened voice he could hear faintly through the phone. He did not hesitate for long. "Put her on." "Daddy?" Lily's voice cracked through the speaker, thick with tears. "I had a bad dream. Mommy was there, and then she wasn't there, and I couldn't find her." "I know, baby. I know," Daniel said, his own voice softening instantly, all the tension of the evening falling away into the singular focus he reserved only for his daughter. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere, okay? You are safe, and I am going to be home soon. And tomorrow we can look at the pictures of Mommy together if you want." "Do you want me to stay on the phone until you fall back asleep?" "Yes, please," Lily whispered. Daniel stood near the restaurant's front window for the next several minutes, murmuring soft, steady reassurances to his daughter, describing the stars outside the window, reminding her of the silly voice her mother used to do when she read her bedtime stories, until her breathing slowed, and Sophie confirmed she had drifted back to sleep. When Daniel finally turned back toward the dining room, phone still in hand, he realized with a jolt that Richard had been watching him the entire time, his own dinner forgotten, an expression on his face that Daniel could not immediately place. Daniel returned to his table, apologizing again to Ava, who waved off the apology with genuine understanding, rather than the polite tolerance he had braced himself for. But before he could fully sit down, Richard rose from his own table and crossed the short distance between them, his wife watching with a small, knowing smile. "Daniel," Richard said, and his voice carried none of the clipped authority Daniel associated with the office. "Do you have a moment?" Daniel's heart hammered as he excused himself again, following Richard a few steps away from both tables. He braced himself for a comment about professionalism, about optics, about the inappropriateness of taking personal calls during what Richard might assume was simply an evening off. Instead, Richard's expression had softened into something almost vulnerable. "My son was 6 when my wife and I divorced," Richard said quietly. "For 2 years, I raised him mostly alone, before she and I found our way back to each other. I remember exactly what that felt like, standing in a room full of people, while your entire heart is somewhere else, on the phone with a frightened child, trying to hold 2 completely different lives together, without dropping either one." He paused, glancing back toward his wife. "I have watched you for 3 years, Daniel. I always assumed your dedication came from ambition. Tonight I understand it came from something much harder than that." Daniel did not know what to say, his throat suddenly tight. "I did not want you to think I was not taking this seriously. The promotion, the position. I know how it must have looked, stepping away like that." "It looked like exactly what it was," Richard said, shaking his head slowly. "I spent years believing that showing anyone my son's school pickup schedule, or admitting I had to leave a board meeting early because he had a fever, would make people think I was not serious about my career. I built a wall around that part of my life, so high that even my own wife used to say I treated home like a place I visited between meetings. It cost me more than any missed deal ever could have. I am not interested in watching you make the same mistake, Daniel. Not when I have spent 3 years watching you quietly outwork everyone in that building, while carrying something none of D. Not her D. Daniel swallowed hard, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background as Richard's words settled over him. He thought about all the mornings he had rehearsed calm, composed answers to give if anyone in the office ever asked why he looked tired. All the times he succeeds, with a joke rather than admit how hard some days truly were. Hearing Richard, of all people, name that exhaustion out loud, and not as a weakness, but as evidence of something worth respecting, felt like a door quietly opening somewhere he had assumed was permanently sealed shut. It looked like a father who loves his daughter more than he loves impressing his boss, Richard said, a small, unfamiliar smile crossing his face. "That is not a weakness, Daniel. In 3 years, that is the most important thing I have learned about you. And it is exactly why this company needs you leading a team, not just executing someone else's vision. The senior director position is yours. I was going to tell you on Monday, but I do not see a reason to wait." For a moment, Daniel could not speak at all. He thought of every late night he had spent, convinced that no one noticed the sacrifices. Every morning, he had rushed from dropping Lily at school to a 9:00 race, meeting with his heart still racing. Every time he had quietly wondered if trying to be both a devoted father and a rising professional was simply an impossible math problem with no solution. Richard's words settled something in him that had been unsettled since October 2 years ago. "Thank you," Daniel finally managed. "That means more than you know." Richard nodded once, then glanced toward Ava, who was watching the exchange with quiet warmth from their table. "Go finish your dinner, Daniel. Whatever this is," he gestured lightly between Daniel and Ava. "Do not let the job interfere with it either. Believe me, the work will still be there tomorrow. The people who matter will not always be." When Daniel returned to the table, Ava was smiling at him, in a way that made the entire chaotic evening feel suddenly, impossibly worth it. "Good news, I take it?" she asked. "The best news I have had in 2 years, Daniel admitted, sitting back down. feeling lighter than he had in longer than he could remember. Along with maybe the worst first date I have ever had. Ava laughed. A real, unguarded laugh that made the tension of the evening dissolve completely. I would like a second one, she said. Preferably somewhere without your boss, at the next table. But I am flexible. They talked for another hour after that, long after the plates had been cleared, long after Richard and his wife had said their quiet goodbyes on their way out, Richard pausing only to squeeze Daniel's shoulder once, a small gesture that spoke louder than any performance review ever could. Daniel walked Ava to her car, under a sky full of stars. The same stars he had described to Lily over the phone an hour earlier, and for the first time since Rachel's death, he felt something that was not quite happiness but was close enough to it that he did not want to let it go. Driving home that night, Daniel called Melissa before he had even pulled out of the parking lot. "You will not believe what happened tonight," he said. And then he told her everything. The panic of seeing Richard walk in, the phone call from Sophie, Lily's frightened voice, Richard's confession about his own son, the promotion offered right there between two dinner tables, and Ava's laughter carrying him through all of it. "I told you she was worth the risk," Melissa said. And Daniel could hear the smile in her voice, even through the phone. "Sometimes the universe has a strange sense of timing, Daniel. You just have to be brave enough to show up for it." When Daniel got home that night, he paid Sophie, checked on Lily one last time, watching her sleep peacefully in the soft glow of her nightlight. The same nightlight Rachel had picked out years ago, because Lily was afraid of the dark. He sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, thinking about how much had changed in a single evening, and how much had somehow, quietly, stayed exactly the same in all the ways that mattered most. He thought about Rachel, about the life they had built together, and the life he was now, cautiously, beginning to build without her. He did not feel guilty in the way he had expected to feel if this night ever came, sitting in a restaurant with someone new, laughing the way he used to laugh, before grief had rewritten every part of him. Instead, he felt something closer to permission, the permission Rachel herself would have given him without hesitation, the permission to keep living fully, to keep loving fiercely, to build something new out of the pieces she had left behind, in the shape of their daughter. In the weeks that followed, Daniel noticed small shifts he had not expected. Richard, who had always kept a careful professional distance from every member of his team, began stopping by Daniel's desk on Friday afternoons, just to ask how Lily's dinosaur phase was progressing, or whether she had settled on marine biology over astronomy yet. It was a small thing, barely a few minutes of conversation each week, but it changed the entire texture of their working relationship, transforming Richard from a distant authority figure into something closer to a mentor who genuinely understood the invisible weight Daniel carried every day. Daniel found himself working with a different kind of energy after that night, not the anxious, prove-yourself energy that had defined his first 2 years at the company, but something steadier, rooted in the knowledge that his worth had never actually depended on, hiding the parts of his life that made him human. Lily, for her part, adjusted to Ava's presence with the particular bluntness only an 8-year-old could offer. On their second outing together, a trip to the local science museum, Lily had studied Ava with the serious, evaluating expression she usually reserved for new species of dinosaur, before finally declaring that Ava was acceptable because she knew the correct number of bones in a stegosaurus's tail spikes, a fact Daniel later learned Ava had studied specifically the night before in preparation. It was a small gesture, but it told Daniel everything he needed to know about how seriously Ava was taking them, and it made something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 2 long years. 3 weeks later, Daniel took the senior director position, and 2 months after that, he took Lily and Ava to the aquarium on a bright Saturday afternoon, watching his daughter press her small hands against the glass of the shark tank, while Ava crouched beside her, patiently, answering every rapid-fire question about ocean predators, with the same gentle, attentiveness she brought to everything. Richard's words echoed in Daniel's mind that day, about the people who matter, and the work that will always still be there tomorrow. And for the first time in 2 long years, Daniel understood, completely and without doubt, exactly what those words meant. Being a single father had taught Daniel more about strength than any promotion or performance review ever could. It had taught him how to braid hair badly, and then better, how to sit through a school play twice in 1 week, because Lily forgot her lines the first time, how to grieve quietly at 2 in the morning, so that his daughter would never see the cracks, and only ever see the steadiness he fought so hard to give her. But that one unpredictable, terrifying, extraordinary night at the Oakwood taught him something else entirely, something he carried with him every single day afterward. Sometimes the very thing you are most afraid will destroy everything you have built is actually the thing that finally sets you free to build something even better. Sometimes your boss is not just your boss. Sometimes a blind date is not just a blind date. And sometimes the people watching us most closely, the ones we fear will judge us hardest, turn out to be the ones who understand our hearts the best, because they have carried the exact same weight themselves, in the quiet hours, when no one else was watching. If this story moved you even a little tonight, remember to like this video and subscribe for more real, emotional stories about love, loss, and second chances. Because there are so many more journeys like Daniel's still waiting to be told, and you will not want to miss a single one of them.